"This is our only chance, Johann," Lena said, holding the small syringe in her shaking hand. Emma's weak breathing filled the room like an oppressive beat. Johann stood there with his arms crossed, his forehead furrowed. He had often been silent in the last few weeks, but now his voice broke through the silence. "What if we make it worse?" His words were quiet, but cutting. "These medicines are strong, Lena. We should wait until the doctor says otherwise." Lena turned abruptly to him, her face marked by exhaustion and fear. "Wait? Waiting for what? On her getting even weaker? Johann, she's losing more strength every day. I see it in her eyes. We have to do something, and we have to do it now." Johann let his gaze wander to Emma, who was lying motionless on the sofa. Her little hand was clutching her pink bear tightly. The image of his daughter, so fragile, sent a sharp pain through his body. "What if we're wrong?" he asked quietly. "What if—" "There is no if," Lena cut him off. "I can't watch her suffer anymore. I'll increase the dose. It's our only choice." Johann wanted to object, but the determination in Lena's voice silenced him. He watched as she prepared the syringe and sat down next to Emma. She whispered softly, "Everything will be okay, my darling. Mum is here." He couldn't take it any longer. Johann turned around and left the room, putting his hands in his pockets. In the kitchen, he reached for a glass of water, but his hands were shaking so much that he put it down. His mind was racing. What if Lena was right? What if they did nothing and Emma died? But he was equally tormented by the thought that they could make the situation worse. A sudden scream ripped him from his thoughts. Johann stormed back into the living room. Lena knelt next to Emma, her hands desperately searching for any sign of life. "Johann, she's not breathing. Call 911. Her voice was full of panic, her eyes wide with fear. Johann reached for the phone, his fingers flying over the keys. As he spoke, Lena rushed back to Emma, trying everything she could to get her daughter back. But when the ambulance arrived, it was too late. Emma was no longer with them. The silence that followed was deafening. Lena sat on the floor with her hands over her face, while Johann stood there stunned, unable to move. The pink bear lay on the sofa, a silent witness to what had just happened. Johann finally turned to Lena, his voice rough. "What have you done?" It wasn't a question, but an accusation that lingered in the room. Lena raised her head, her eyes full of tears, but she said nothing. What else could she have said? The hours after Emma's death blurred into a painful fog of silence and emptiness. They both knew their lives would never be the same again. But none of them knew that the real tragedy was just beginning. The apartment was quiet, an oppressive silence that swallowed everything. Words, movements, even time seemed to have lost its flow. Johann sat at the kitchen table, his hands gripping an empty cup, while Lena sat motionless on the sofa, holding the pink bear in her arms. Neither of them had spoken for hours. "You loved her, didn't you?" Johann suddenly asked, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. Lena looked at him in shock, as if she hadn't expected him to break the silence. "Of course I loved her," she replied, her voice shaking. "How can you ask something like that?" Johann slammed his fist on the table. The cup clinked and rolled over the edge. "Then explain to me how this could have happened. How could you be so careless?" His words cut like a knife, and Lena flinched, her eyes filling with tears. "I wanted to help her," she whispered. "I just wanted her to stop suffering. I was tired, Johann, so tired, and I wasn't paying attention." Her voice broke and she looked away, unable to meet his accusatory eyes. Johann got up, went to the window, and stared out into the darkness. "Being tired is no excuse," he said coldly. "She was our child, Lena, our everything, and now she's gone." His words hung heavily in the room, and Lena felt as if he had pulled the rug out from under her feet. "Do you think I don't know?" she cried suddenly, her voice loud and desperate. "I live with this guilt every second. Do you think there's a moment when I don't think about what I did?" She stood up and threw the pink bear on the table. "That's all that's left of her, Johann, a stuffed animal and those terrible memories." Johann turned to her, his eyes full of pain and anger. It's not just your fault, Lena. It's mine too. I should have insisted we wait. But I allowed it because I was just as helpless as you. Lena looked at him, her tears silently streaming down her face. What should we do now? She asked quietly. How are we supposed to continue living with this burden? Johan didn't answer. He didn't know. The guilt weighed like a stone on his chest, and he couldn't imagine how they could ever be free of it. Instead, he grabbed the pink bear and held it tightly. I need answers, he finally said. I need to know what exactly happened. Lena frowned. What do you mean by that? Johan looked at her. His eyes were hard and determined. The camera, he said. The one in the bear. I installed it months ago to monitor Emma when we weren't in the room. Maybe there's something on there that will show us what really happened. Lena stared at him, her eyes wide with shock. You monitored her the whole time? Johan nodded. It was for her safety. I had almost forgotten it. But now it might help us see the truth. And if the truth is worse than we can bear, Lena whispered. Johan paused before answering. Then we'll have to live with it, just like with everything else. The night dragged on forever as Johan and Lena sat next to each other, looking at the camera footage and confronting the past. With each passing second, the truth grew closer, and with it, the inescapable realization that nothing could prepare them for what they were about to see. The atmosphere in the room was thick and heavy as Johan removed the small memory chip from the pink bear. He held it between his fingers as if it were a time capsule that could explain all her torment or add to it. Lena sat on the sofa, her arms wrapped around her knees, watching him in silence. Her eyes were empty, but her breathing was shallow and irregular. It was clear that she was afraid of what they were about to see. Johan inserted the chip into the laptop. The device hummed quietly while the files loaded. A single video clip appeared on the screen, dated to the night they would never forget. He hesitated, his finger hovering over the play button. Are you ready? He asked without looking at her. Lena nodded, even though she knew there was no right answer. How could you be prepared for something that could change everything? With a deep breath, Johan pressed play. The video started in Emma's room. The camera was focused on the crib, and the soft light from the bedside lamp cast long shadows on the walls. Emma lay on her side, clutching the pink bear tightly, while Lena leaned over her. Johan felt his stomach tighten when he saw his wife in the video. Lena, in the video, spoke quietly to Emma, her voice gentle and soothing. She had the syringe in her hand, and the bottle with the medication was next to her. Johan watched every movement, every gesture as she prepared the dose. He saw her pause, hesitate for a moment, then place the syringe on the mattress and reach over to gently turn Emma's head. I remember that, Lena whispered, her voice barely audible. I wanted to make sure she was comfortable. Johan didn't answer. His eyes remained fixed on the screen. In the video, Lena reached for the syringe again, but in her haste, or perhaps exhaustion, she drew up the wrong amount. It was a small mistake, barely noticeable, but Johan saw it immediately. His breath hitched. There it is, he said quietly, his voice rough with shock and horror. Lena looked away, unable to bear the image any longer. The scene continued to play out, irrevocably. Lena injected Emma with the medication, murmured soothing words, and put the syringe aside. She tucked Emma in, stroked her hair, and left the room without the slightest awareness of the mistake she had made. Minutes passed, and the camera continued recording. Johan couldn't stop staring. Suddenly, Emma began to feel restless. Her breathing became heavier, and her small body twitched slightly. Johan felt an invisible hand close around his heart. There was nothing he could do but watch as his daughter struggled in the final moments of her life. That's enough, Lena said suddenly, her voice full of desperation. She reached for the laptop and closed it with a loud bang. Tears streamed down her face, and she shook her head. I can't see it anymore, Johan. I know what I did. I don't need this video to remind me over and over again. Johan stood up, his hands balled into fists. His gaze was blank, and yet there was a flame burning in his eyes, a flame of anger, sadness, and a desperate search for answers. "We can't ignore this, Lena," he said sharply. "This is the truth. This is the proof." "Proof of what?" Lena shouted back. "That I killed our child. Do you think I need a camera to know this? I carry this guilt with me every day, Johan. Every single day." The words echoed in the silence, and Johan stood still, unable to find an answer. He knew she was right, but knowing the truth wasn't enough. He wanted more. He wanted justice for Emma and for what had been taken from them. But at that moment, he wasn't sure if there could be such a thing as justice. The apartment was plunged into an ominous silence, broken only occasionally by the gentle ticking of the kitchen clock. Johan sat on a chair, his elbows on his knees, his head buried in his hands. The laptop was in front of him, the screen was dark, but the images he had seen kept replaying in his head. Lena stood at the other end of the room, holding the pink bear in her arms, as if it were the only thing that still connected her to Emma. "We can't go on like this, Lena," Johan finally said, his voice rough and exhausted. Lena looked up, her eyes red and swollen. "I know," she whispered. "But what do you want to do, Johan? What can we do?" He straightened, his eyes sparkling with determination. "We have to go to the police," he said. "The video, it shows everything you need to know." Lena took a step back, her fingers digging deeper into the bear's fur. "To the police?" Her voice was shaking. "Johan, that will make everything worse. They will arrest me. Our lives are being torn apart." "Our lives have already been torn apart," Johan replied sharply. "Emma is dead, Lena. Nothing can change that. But I can't pretend nothing happened. I can't live with this lie." Lena stared at him, her lips trembling. "It wasn't a crime, Johan. It was a mistake. A terrible, terrible mistake. But I didn't intentionally hurt Emma." "I know that," said Johan, his voice becoming softer. "I know you loved her, but love alone doesn't change what happened. It's not just about us, it's about Emma." Lena collapsed onto the sofa, her hands shaking. "And what will happen to us? Do you think we'll survive this, Johan? That we can get through this?" Johan sat down opposite her, his gaze fixed on her. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I know that the truth is the only way. For Emma, for us, for everything." The minutes dragged on like hours as they looked at each other, each of them battling their own demons. Finally, Lena nodded slowly, tears streaming down her cheeks. "If you think it's the right thing," she said quietly, "then I'll go with you." Johan felt a mixture of relief and regret. He had made the decision, but the price was high, perhaps too high. But there was no going back. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "We're leaving tomorrow morning." The night was unbearable. Johan lay awake in bed, his thoughts circling incessantly. Lena lay next to him, her eyes closed, but he knew she wasn't sleeping. Her breathing was too shallow, her movements too restless. They shared a bed, but the gap between them seemed insurmountable. In the morning, the sun shone through the curtains, but its warmth didn't reach them. Lena sat silently at the kitchen table, the pink bear next to her. Johan came to her, a hand on her shoulder. "Are you ready?" he asked. Lena nodded without looking at him. Her eyes were on the bear, and Johan knew she was thinking of Emma. They left the house together, their footsteps heavy, the silence between them oppressive. The police station seemed intimidating, the smell of disinfectant and paper filling the air. An officer at the front desk looked at the two as they entered. "How can I help you?" he asked. Johan took a deep breath, his hand resting on the USB stick in his pocket. "We would like to report an incident," he said. His voice was firm, even though his heart was racing. Lena stood next to him, pale and silent. The officer led them into a small room where they sat down. Johan put the USB stick on the table. His fingers trembled slightly. "This is a video," he said. "It shows how our daughter, how she died. It was an accident, but it's my wife who gave the medicine." Lena swallowed hard, her hands balled into fists. She said nothing. Her eyes were focused on the table. The officer nodded, took the stick and left the room. The minutes that followed felt like an eternity. "We did the right thing," Johan said quietly, more to himself than to Lena. She didn't answer, but a tear rolled down her cheek. It was a first step, but the road ahead was long and full of uncertainties. The small space in the police station seemed to grow narrower as the minutes ticked by. Lena and Johan sat next to each other, both silent, but weighed down by the same burden. Lena's hands were cold, her fingers intertwined restlessly. Johan noticed, placing his hand over hers, but the gesture felt mechanical, like something he had to do, but with no real connection. The door opened and the officer entered, USB stick in hand. His expression was neutral, but his eyes studied the couple with a mixture of professionalism and compassion. "We reviewed the video," he began. "It is clear to see that the overdose was not intentional, but we have to investigate. Ms. Schaefer, we need a statement from you." Lena nodded slowly. Her throat felt tight. I'll tell everything," she said quietly. Johan wanted to say something to encourage her, but the words got stuck in his throat. The reality of what they were doing here hit him with full force. They were telling their own story, their mistakes, their grief, their guilt. The officer pulled out a recording device and sat across from them. "Mrs. Schaefer, please describe what happened that night." Lena took a deep breath, her voice shaking as she spoke. "Emma, she was sick. The doctor gave us new medication that we should take regularly. That night, she was so weak. I thought if I increased the dosage, it would help her get stronger." She paused, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I was tired, careless. I didn't realize I was giving her too much. It was a mistake, a terrible mistake." The officer wrote notes and occasionally asked questions to clarify details. Johan sat next to Lena, his hands firmly on his knees, unable to do anything. He wanted to protect her, wanted to free her from this burden, but he knew there was nothing he could do. "Mrs. Schaefer," the officer finally said, "your case will be forwarded. There will be a hearing to determine whether charges will be filed. Until then, you will not be in custody, but we ask that you remain available." Lena nodded, her eyes blank. Johan felt a sharp pain in his chest as he saw the exhaustion on her face. The officer politely said goodbye and left the couple alone. Johan got up, helped Lena up, and they left the station. The air was cool outside and the streets were almost empty. Johan led Lena to the car, but when they got in, neither of them spoke. The drive home was silent, the low hum of the engine the only sound to break the tension. When she got home, Lena sat on the sofa and stared into nothingness. Johan brought her a glass of water, which she accepted without saying a word. "We did the right thing," he said finally, his voice rough. "For Emma, for us." Lena looked at him, her eyes full of tears. "But why does it feel like we have lost everything?" Her words hit Johan like a blow. He didn't have an answer because he felt the same way. The loss of Emma, the guilt they both carried, it was as if their world had been irrevocably broken. The next few days passed in a blur. Johan and Lena spoke little to each other, each struggling with their own demons. The thought of the impending hearing hung over them like a dark cloud. Lena began to withdraw, while Johan spent more and more time looking at old photos of Emma, as if he was trying to preserve some of her past. One evening, when the silence in the house had become unbearable, Johan came to Lena, who was sitting on the sofa and holding the pink bear in her arms. "Lena," he began hesitantly. She looked up at him, her eyes tired and empty. "I know it feels like there is no way out of this darkness, but I hope we can do this together." Lena paused before nodding slowly. "I want to believe that," she said quietly, "but I don't know how." Johan sat down next to her and placed a hand on hers. "Maybe we both don't know," he admitted, "but we can try to find a way. For Emma, It was a small promise, little more than a fleeting hope. But in the midst of the darkness, it was all they had. And maybe, Johan thought, that was a start. The day of the hearing came faster than Johan and Lena had imagined. They sat together in the waiting area of the court. The atmosphere was heavy, and the voices of others present sounded like a distant murmur. Lena held onto her pink bear as if it were a protective barrier against the reality that awaited her. "We will get through this," Johan whispered, putting a hand on her arm. His voice sounded determined, but inside he felt just as insecure as Lena. She just nodded, unable to speak, and stared at the floor. A bailiff entered and called her name. Lena stood up slowly, her legs feeling like they would give out at any moment. Johan reached for her hand to support her, and they entered the courtroom together. The room was simple, but the situation was anything but simple. Lena sat down next to her lawyer while Johan took a seat on the spectator bench. The judge entered the room, his presence bringing with it an almost oppressive silence. "The Schaefer case," he began, leafing through the files. "It concerns the death of a child due to an accidental overdose. Miss Schaefer, how do you plead?" Lena stood up, her hands shaking. "Guilty," she said quietly but clearly. The judge nodded and invited her to give her statement. Lena began to speak slowly, her voice trembling, but she held on. She recounted her daughter's illness, the exhaustion that overwhelmed her, and the fatal mistake that led to Emma's death. Tears streamed down her face, but she tried to keep her words clear and honest. "I loved my daughter," she said finally, her voice breaking. "I wanted to help her, not harm her, but I failed." The prosecutor spoke of negligence, but emphasized that there was no criminal intent. Lena's lawyer argued that she was already living with a guilt that was worse than any punishment. The judge listened carefully, asked questions, and took notes. Johan sat in silence, his heart heavy, while the words in the room struck him like knives. After hours of trial, the judge finally announced his verdict. "Mrs. Schaefer," he began, "this is a tragic case. It is clear that there was no malicious behavior, but the consequences of your actions are serious. I am giving you a 2-year suspended sentence and 200 hours of community service. I hope you use this time to not only rehabilitate yourself, but also to help others." Lena nodded, her tears flowing silently. Johan felt a mixture of relief and heaviness. The punishment was lenient, but the emotional burden they bore was unchanged. As they left the courtroom, the sun was high in the sky, but its warmth did not reach them. Johan put an arm around Lena, who was leaning against him, exhausted by what had happened. "It's over," he said quietly, "at least this part." Lena nodded weakly. "But the pain remains," she whispered. Johan couldn't contradict her. They had been through hell, and the scars would remain. But maybe, he thought, they could eventually find a way to live with these scars. In the weeks that followed, Lena began her charitable work at a hospice for children. She helped other families struggling with illness and loss and found a small shred of comfort in that. Johan supported her wherever he could and began to talk to other parents who had experienced similar fates. Their relationship remained fragile, but they held on to each other, like two people seeking shelter in a storm. Every small gesture, every word of comfort was a step forward, an attempt to rebuild the bridge between them. It was a long journey, but they had started it together. The days after the hearing felt different, not easier but clearer. There was a path ahead, even if it was full of challenges. Johan and Lena felt like they finally had control over something again, even if they were just small decisions. But the emptiness Emma had left behind was ever present, and the guilt was a constant companion. Lena began her work in the hospice with mixed feelings. The thought of being confronted with seriously ill children on a daily basis was frightening, but she knew that this was an opportunity to do something good for Emma, for others, and for herself. On the first day, she met a mother who was with her, was sitting in one of the lounges with her seriously ill son. The woman looked exhausted, but there was a spark of hope in her eyes that Lena hadn't felt in a long time. "You work here?" the woman asked quietly as Lena approached her. Lena hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, I'm new here," she replied, her voice hesitant. The woman smiled weakly. "It's hard, isn't it, seeing the kids fight? But at the same time, it's also beautiful how much love they can show, even in the hardest moments." These words stayed with Lena. In the days that followed, she devoted herself to her task with a dedication that surprised even herself. She read stories to the children, played with them, and talked to parents seeking comfort. It was painful, but it was also healing. Every moment she spent with the children felt like a quiet tribute to Emma. Johan supported Lena as best he could, but he was also looking for a way to deal with his own grief. One evening when Lena came home late, she found him in Emma's room. He sat on the floor, surrounded by her toys and photos. In his hands, he held the diary they had kept for Emma, full of little stories and memories. "I was thinking about continuing the diary," he said as Lena quietly entered the room. "Not for Emma, but for us. Maybe it will help us to preserve the beautiful moments, instead of just focusing on the pain." Lena sat down next to him, her hand resting on his knee. "That sounds nice," she said quietly. "Maybe we can do it together." Agreed. Over the next few weeks, the diary began to become a part of her everyday life. They wrote about the memories they had shared with Emma, but also about the new experiences they had. Lena's work in the hospice, Johan's participation in a support group for parents who had lost children. It was a slow, careful process, but it felt like a step in the right direction. One day, while Lena was working at the hospice, she received a card from one of the families she had spoken to. It said, "Thank you for showing us that despite the pain, there is still light." The words touched Lena deeply. For the first time since Emma's death, she felt like she was making a difference, not just to others, but to herself too. In the evening, when Johan came home, she showed him the card. He read it and looked at Lena, a faint smile on his lips. "Emma would be proud of you," he said. Lena nodded, tears streaming down her face. But they weren't just tears of pain. It was like a small part of her found hope again. The scars Emma had left behind would never go away. They both knew that. But in their grief, they slowly found a way to move on, not by forgetting, but by remembering, by living for Emma and for the light she had brought in her short life. That evening, when they opened the diary, they wrote a new line together. "Today we learned how to love again." It was a small step, but it was a beginning. And sometimes they thought that was all it took. Life is fragile, and in every mistake, in every loss, there is a painful lesson. Johan and Lena have shown that healing does not mean forgetting the wounds, but rather living with them and finding new ways to carry on love. Her story reminds us of the importance of forgiveness and hope, even when the path to get there seems dark. If this story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk together about love, loss, and new beginnings. Don't forget to like this video and share it with others who may need this message. And if you're looking forward to more emotional, moving stories, subscribe to our channel and be ready for more unforgettable moments. Stay tuned now, because another emotional journey awaits you on the next page. A stroke of fate that changed a life forever. Watch this new story and be inspired.